A warm welcome to everyone for joining today. This panel is titled A Bridge Over Troubled Water, Anticipating and Reimagining the Future of Rivers in Southeast Asia. I'm really glad to see so many participants have taken the time to join us today. And I think we have a really engaging panel for you with 6 very well-experienced and insightful speakers. In Southeast Asia, rivers hold diverse meanings, values, and relationships to people. They have been historically interwoven into a diversity of cultures and lives and support many river-dependent livelihoods across the region. They've also been valued locally and globally for the remarkable biodiversity. But in recent decades, rivers have also been transformed by economic modernization processes, including the construction of large-scale water infrastructure, including irrigation schemes and large hydropower dams. So this is what's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, there are many other approaches to thinking about rivers, including sustaining river-dependent livelihoods and protecting and recovering ecosystems. In this context, there continues to be intense debate about the diverse perspectives on the value and use of rivers for the present and the future. And all of these discussions have implications for social and ecological justice. In this panel, we plan to address the following questions. What are the possible futures for the region's rivers? Who benefits and who loses out in each of these futures? Which futures are more desirable? And how could those desirable futures be attained? We have 6 panelists today who will discuss on these topics, so please let me briefly introduce them. Their full bios are available online, so if you'd like to have a look at their more detailed background, you can visit the conference website. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Assistant Professor Chol Bunnag, who is the Thailand Manager of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Thank you very much for joining us, Ajahn Chon.
Thank you.
Then I'd like to introduce Pianporn Deetes, who many of us know as Pai. She is Thailand and Myanmar Campaigns Director for International Rivers. Thank you for joining us, Pai. Then we have John Bright, who is Water Program Manager with the Karen Environmental and Social Action Network. So thank you for joining us, John. We have Associate Professor Raymond Wang, who we know as Ray, and he is with the Center for Social Sciences in the Southern University of Science and Technology in China. So thank you very much for joining us today, Ray.
Thank you for having me.
Then we have Dr. Yong who is a fellow at the East-West Center, just recently relocated to East-West Center before living in Cambodia. Thank you for joining us, Ming Lee. And then we have Tarek Ketelsen, who is the Director General of the Australian Mekong Partnership for Environmental Resources and Energy Systems, also known as AMPERES. Thank you also, Tarek, for joining us. So with that brief introduction, let's dive straight into the panel discussion. For the format for today, some of the panelists have a couple of PowerPoint slides, but we're basically aiming for a discussion across the group. So we will have 2 rounds of discussion where each speaker will be invited to speak for 5 minutes or 3 minutes for the first and second round respectively. And then we'll open up the floor for question and answers. And as Trishna mentioned, if you'd like to ask questions either to the group or to individual speakers, please put them into the chat box and we'll definitely come to them in the latter part of the panel discussion. So let's begin with this first round for the panel discussion. So we're going to tackle the first 2 questions. What are the possible futures for the region's rivers, and who benefits and who loses out in each of these futures? So let me first turn to Ajahn Chon. The floor is yours for the first 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Khao, and thank you for having me. I will be looking at this issue from the perspective of my research on water resource management measures that align with socio-economic development in Thailand. It was a big project, lasted for like 5 years. I went to study water management in all regions of Thailand, and I was taking care of the water governance issues, community-based initiative, and economic instruments for water allocation. So I guess I will be coming through the angle of like within a country, rivers, and perhaps from economic and policy perspective. So I think to look at the future, I think I should identify drivers. So in this 5 minutes, I would talk about I would look into 3 main drivers. The first one is the climate change impact. The second one is the economic development model. And the last one is the water governance. So for the climate change impact, I think it's quite easy to say that climate change is going to intensify drought and flood. So in this case, I will talk only about the drought and the impact. So with the context of the drought, more intensifying drought, when we bring economic development into the picture, we would see that since the policy is tending to promote economic growth, that means the water use will be increasing, and that will intensify the water stress at the national level, and especially at the major rivers in the country, for example, Chao Phraya River, or even Moon or Shi River in the northeastern part of the country. But at the local level, for example, the eastern part of the country, water conflicts will be intensified. Since industry and services need constant flow of water in their production, and farmers also need water for their plants. In terms of water governance, Thailand has a relatively less centralized water governance, because right now they have water basin committee and started to work already. But there are some problems because the water basin committee is still very large. For small river, I think it's fine. But for the river that cut across several provinces and have so many branches, like Shi or Moon River, that have more than 20 branch rivers, the unfit governance could make things more complicated. So I think the first future that I would say, the projected river, the projected future is that I would say there will be increasing water stress everywhere due to climate change and economic development drivers. Moderate to high level of conflict in water use at local level. Small rivers have potential to deal with change better because the governance fits with the geographical complexity, but the larger ones will be more problematic. And economic measures and for water management that the government try to implement might not work efficiently because they try to centralize them. So the measurements, I mean, the instruments will not be flexible, and people will not be happy about it. So who's going to benefit from this projected future? I would say, compared to a few years back, everyone actually benefiting from a relatively more flexible and decentralized water governance. But the losers is in the future, and actually very near future. With the growth mentality, the ones whose product is low value or unable to be quantified or monetized will lose first. For example, like agricultural sector and those who use water for non-economic purposes. But there are other possible futures. For example, the greener growth future. For example, if BCG bio-circular green economy policy works, that would probably delay the projected future, but it will eventually arrive. Another future would be the decentralized water governance future. If the water basin committees are freer to do what they think it should be done in the area, that could also delay the projected future because they can solve the problem better. But if you want a more desirable future, I think we need to look into something more major change, like post-growth future. How can we improve our livelihood without growth, so then we can reduce or even lower water stress that would come after? And what would happen if we can achieve the climate target? But without the post-growth future, it will still be a problematic, just a delayed one. So that would be my 5 minutes, Ajahn Kao.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Chon. You covered a lot of ground there in 5 minutes, and there are many different potential scenarios and drawing our attention to some key drivers. Let's turn now to Pai. The floor is yours, Pai, for those 2 questions. I'll share your slide.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Kao. For the first question, what I'm foreseeing the future of the regions, rivers. This is a very hard question for me because based been thinking about what would the future of our rivers look like in the next 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, based on my work on the Mekong and Salween since 2000, early 2000. What I'm foreseeing is that two parts. One is that more destructive development and infrastructure projects would still going ahead in the country where there is less space for civil society to raise concern over injustice or over the mismanagement of shared natural resources, like the dams in Laos, the upper Mekong dams in the Lanchang River might still be going ahead and producing transboundary impacts to the downstream countries or upstream countries, if it's the case of the Sayaburi Dam or other dams project on the Mekong River in Laos. But I think, yeah, this kind of complex transboundary issues would not be able to be solved without recognition of the riparian country's government that accept this is as a problem, and then they need to sit down together and look at what's actually the problem are, and then include all the voice of the affected communities. And the second part, I think, is that if it's close to, is it on the Thai soil, at least the Thai citizen can exercise our rights to use the function of the Thai environmental law, for example, in the case of the Pak Bang Dam project when it's proposed and would have impacts on Thai side. We use the law that requests the project developer to disclose information and hold public consultation with the affected communities. And one of the good news that we just received last night was that the Supreme Administrative Court in Bangkok will read the final verdict of the well-known Sayaburi Dam lawsuit in first week of May, but it will be online. So we are looking forward to this verdict reading, and we'd like to see how the extraterritorial obligation will look like in the case of the dams on transboundary or international rivers. When I think I still have maybe 2 minutes. In the case of the sister river, like the Salween River, as I said, that when the project is on Thai side, on Thai soil, we still are able to exercise the rights of the civil society or the citizen of Thailand. So we can still use the existing law that we have in the country. In the case of the water diversion project that proposed by the Royal Irrigation Department, for the past 5 years, the local affected communities who are the current indigenous people but citizen, they're still able to request for the copy of the environmental impact assessment and request the Royal Irrigation Department to share with them information and invite them to the consultation. So I think I'm looking forward to the better laws that protect the rivers in the region. And for now, we still have the Thai law. But in the future, if there will be more extraterritorial obligation, I'm seeing the brighter future of the river's future. If not, I will be seeing more dispossession of the common properties, the Mekong, Salween, and other shared resources. And for sure, last thing that I'd like to highlight is that I'm seeing growing and stronger awareness of the public on social and environmental costs, particularly among the younger generations, among the students and the teenagers, Twitter users. So I think it would be more difficult for destructive projects to happen if there is a space for civil society. So that would be my first round.
Great, thank you very much, Pai. You covered also a lot of important points there, on including the highly anticipated announcement for the Sayaburi court case. So let's turn now towards the Salween. Can I invite Sojourn Bright to share some thoughts, and I will share your PowerPoint slides.
Thank you, Dr. Carl. Nice to see you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I want to discuss this question of the future of the river in Southeast Asia from the Salween context, where I'm closely working with. So when it comes to the Salween River, I see two possible futures. One is a free-flowing river that is governed at local level through community-based water governance and are linked to state transformation processes to bring water justice and peace. And another future will be a river that is cut up by mega hydropower dams and governed by some powerful actors through top-down means. So let me talk about the first one, the free-flowing Salween River, the one that we want. So a free-flowing Salween River is the heartbeat of territories of indigenous people. This includes the land of my indigenous Karen people, seeing the river as a sustaining rich biodiversity, enabling a river as sustaining rich biodiversity, enabling sustainable land governance based on our indigenous knowledge and practices. This free-flowing river see development as locally owned pathways chosen by local community themselves, and refuse and sustainable economic models driven by colonial legacy, if you like, and refuse centralized or top-down conservation approaches that let out indigenous communities from decision-making processes. And here, the future of free-flowing river means water justice and peace. So who benefit? So everyone benefit. Millions of people look at people benefiting, and they are also depending on river for their livelihood and also unique biodiversity. In Karen communities, we are working on strengthening grassroots governance models such as the Salween Peace Park, as you can see on the slide, that uphold indigenous self-determination and honor the sacred relationship between indigenous Karen people and their lands. So core to this grassroots governance model is the deep relationship between Karen communities and the land, forests, and waterways. So this model empowers Karen community to revitalize their traditional practices, assert their rights, and manage their own natural resources. And this is about grassroots democracy and decision-making by and for indigenous people and local communities. In the Salween Peace Park, a charter was developed together with indigenous elders and community representatives and ensure that decisions uphold collective well-being of all communities and are based upon the collective vision of the people. And most importantly, this is the affirmation of Karen self-determination, which means respect for the Karen traditions and way of life, recognizing and respecting the value of Karen traditional resource governance system. And for Karen, self-determination does not mean cessation. It means respecting Karen community as equal partners in a future federal democratic Burma. And the model also has also helped communities in bringing their voices and vision to international community. For example, by linking them to global movement for indigenous declared protected areas, known as ICCAs and territories of life, and also contribute globally to combat climate change and biodiversity and conserving biodiversity. And the second feature I would say is the one that we don't want, a river that is cut up by mega hydropower dams and governed by international, by national level, top down, means that benefit only corrupt people. This is a river devoid of rich biodiversity, losing its spiritual meaning to people as it no longer flows freely and support neither rich biodiversity nor the livelihoods and spirituality of indigenous people. It only serves the short-term interests of people in the capital and energy needs of urban areas and neighboring countries. So a river with full of conflict, and now we have tens of thousands of IDPs and refugees along the Salween River due to conflict and displacement in Burma, in the region. So who benefit? Only corrupt officials, construction companies, big business in neighboring countries, local irresponsible businessmen. And as a result, we have more conflict, increased poverty, mental and physical illness, which means harms for everybody. So to make it brief, for Salween, I see two things. One is the free-flowing river, and the other is the river with mega hydropower dams. And I hope we have the free-flowing river. So I hope this is helpful, and thank you.
Thank you very much, John. You also covered a lot of really important points in a short time. Let's now turn to Ray. Ray, could you share some thoughts with us? Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. First of all, it's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, probably developed based on my previous research on transboundary waters. So in general, in response to the first question, I think my answer would be the possible future would be the coexistence of water conflicts and cooperation, the coexistence of economic development and water conservation. I think the reason that I made this argument that we will never gonna achieve a scenario where everything is harmonious and no conflicts at all, or it's an extremely intensifying situation where no one makes a compromise. I don't think these scenarios, these extreme scenarios will ever occur, because it is more pragmatic, I would say, to acknowledge that there are multiple actors in this river basin, and there are multiple ontologies of water. Water is not just a source for hydropower development or for irrigation. There are so many meanings related around water, and there are so many different governance models, patterns, or institutions that are maybe suitable in different scenarios. So the short answer is there's no panacea that can be subscribed for every actor, for every community, every country. I don't see that's coming. It's never going to exist in the real world. However, we're now in the year of 2022, and moving forward in the future, we've experienced the implications, the tragedies that caused by extreme conflicts. So to me, I believe human beings are capable of finding some middle ground, to make compromises and to achieve certain delicate balance, although this kind of balance might change. So which leads me to the second question, who benefits and who loses out. So I guess it depends on the balance, or whether the powerful push further, or the weak can actually rally together and use the weapons of the weak to fight for their deserved rights. So I guess it's really difficult to say, but I think the coexistence is the future, I guess. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray, for kind of showing us that conflict and cooperation are not mutually exclusive. I think that might come back as a theme later as well. Let's go now to Ming Li. Ming Li, the floor is yours for up to 5 minutes.
Thanks, Carl. I think what I'm going to say really builds on what everyone has already said. I'm coming from the perspective of water governance, environmental governance, public participation, and a little bit of environmental ethics as well. So one possible scenario or future would be the business as usual scenario, where decision makers are acting on national interests that are driven by economic growth, which is more highly valued than the ecosystem services that the Mekong River provides. So in this scenario, the Mekong River is valued mostly in terms of how water can be harnessed for large-scale development projects. and where the transboundary ecological connectivity of the river is downplayed. So yes, maybe GDP will increase, cities and industries will grow, but at what cost? So in such a future, benefits, of course, mostly go to the national governments, to financiers, to private investors and urban populations, both within the river basin and also beyond the river basin itself. However, we really also have to note that the winners and losers in these cases are really complex. It's not just a simple case of upstream countries benefiting against downstream countries, although some countries, of course, have disproportionate influence on others, okay, like China. So Thailand and Vietnam have historically also been proponents of hydropower development. Their state utilities, financiers, and project developers also all benefit from hydropower development in Laos, for example. Within each country, we've got very diverse state and non-state stakeholders. Depending on which part of the country you're looking at, they're both upstream and downstream in relation to different countries. And also all the lower Mekong countries do have dams on the Mekong's tributaries as well. The influence that they have on each other are also shaped by very complex historical relationships with one another. So maybe we need a more nuanced view of who's benefiting or losing out in these scenarios. Rural populations living along the Mekong River and its tributaries are also diverse. They may have differing perspectives on hydropower development, but I do think that the largest cost of these sort of developments is borne by them in terms of the impacts to their livelihoods and food security of millions of people living in the river basin. Especially where ecological systems that support wild capture fisheries and agriculture are undermined. So unfortunately, this is a huge segment of the population that do not get to meaningfully participate in decision-making. So rather, decision-making takes place from the top down, with state actors, private actors, and experts playing key roles, and communities are kind of left to face the consequences on their own. So another possible future would be a more inclusive one in terms of decision-making. Okay, so how do we rethink the benefits and costs of this business as usual approach? How do we incorporate both the tangible and intangible values of the Mekong River when we're doing water resources development planning? So we need to pay attention to the undervalued ecosystem services, the social, cultural, and economic dimensions of the river that are really important to Mekong communities. So from an environmental governance perspective, this future will involve thinking through how local community voices can be better heard and incorporated into such decisions, and how to make these voices become perceived as legitimate from the perspective of powerful actors. So yeah, not to say that meeting electricity demand is not important. Of course, this is quite important, but we do have to think about the future of how water and energy are very closely intertwined, and to consider how the generation of energy through hydropower development can compound the vulnerabilities of populations, and therefore we need to look to alternative energy sources. So I'll talk more about this in the next round. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ming Li. So you've painted two possible directions and you've kind of located public participation quite centrally within shaping them, I think. And you've left us keenly anticipating what will be your next comments in the next round. Let's now go to the final panelist for this round, which is Tarek with AMPERES. Tarek, I'll put your slide up and please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Carl. And it was really interesting to listen to everybody else speak. I noticed actually in this discussion where we're talking about the future of rivers, pretty much all the speakers gravitated towards the issue of hydropower. And I think there's an important reason why hydropower has sort of is emerged as a central problem or a central issue for the futures of rivers in Southeast Asia. there's a physical reason for this in terms of it being a driver of change, but there's also, I think, a symbolic reason. So I'm talking a little bit from the perspective of some new work we're doing, looking at the possibility of rewilding the Mekong. And I'm going to do it from two perspectives. In my life, I've been lucky to have studied and worked as both an engineer and an ecologist. And I think those two perspectives kind of set the bounds of what the futures that the rivers of Southeast Asia can face. The ecology perspective is one of connectivity. The engineering perspective is one of control and management. And I think the futures they put forward are quite different. So if we look from the ecology perspective first, rivers, we can see them as these connectors in the landscape. They are they connect, the upland. I might show the other slides later, Carl. So I'll stick on the cover slide for now. So they're sort of connectors. They transport water and nutrients and sediments and fish and biota and humans up and down the river system. They're variable, and in Southeast Asia, they're incredibly biodiverse and productive as well. And it's this variability, this diversity, and this productivity which is shared through connections throughout the basins with a wide range of beneficiaries, human and non-human. If we take an engineering perspective of a river, they'd look at a river in a slightly different way, and they'd see a river from the potential for, let's say, economic productivity. And they'd look at a river. There's a sort of a way of looking at a river, like in terms of how much water is being utilized and how much is sort of underutilized and being transported to the sea before it's actually used for human use. So the perspective there is that variability, productivity that's dispersed, these are management problems that need to be addressed. And of course, there are good reasons why managing rivers, if you look at like floods and droughts, are important for communities and for human safety and security. But it is a perspective on the river that's slightly different from an ecological one. And I think the dam is central to this, because a dam is something that we know from a biophysical point of view. It regulates and it controls and it traps sediments, it blocks connectivity processes, but it does so also from the perspective of beneficiaries and benefits. So it concentrates benefits as well. So whereas a river might provide a wide range of benefits to a wide range of stakeholders, fertilizing floodplains, fish for rural consumption and so on, dams tend to concentrate those benefits into one sector. And I think that's the kind of the basis of the challenge for which future we will face. And maybe I'll stop there, Carl.
You'll save the other slides for the next round, is that right?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you very much, Tarek. So 6 really important perspectives. Some of them are mutually in agreement, some of them are seeing different futures. And perhaps this is one of the things that we need to sort of recognize about the future not yet being determined and it being subject to the debates of the present. At this point, I would add, if anybody would like to ask questions to the panelists, after the next round, we will have a question and answer session. So please type in your comments into the chat box. So just a few things that have jumped out to me from the first round of discussion. I mean, I think we've heard from the panelists that there are many different people or actors within the region that have a stake in the future. We've heard so many different like indigenous groups, farmers and fishers, including those that are practicing commercial practices or subsistence, local and national governments and the different agencies within them, and then different aspects of the dam industry, as Tarek has pointed towards. A lot of the debate about the future of the river does seem to centralize onto the role of the hydropower construction and its impacts. I think I'm not going to try and summarize all the possibilities because there's been quite a few, but I think we've heard different possible futures already. For example, we've heard very grassroots governance ideas, as Sir John Bright mentioned with the Salween Peace Park. We've also heard about the role of river basin organizations from Ajahn Chon, which kind of looks more at the state facilitated processes. We haven't heard as much yet about transboundary cooperation, although like all the transboundary institutions, although Ming Li kind of made reference to how nation, like the governments sometimes cooperate together. But then Raymond also, Ray also kind of flagged that there can be conflict and cooperation at the same time. So I think, to be honest, I think governance has really come across as the strongest theme for me in the discussion that we've had so far. As Ray mentioned, you know, conflict and cooperation exist simultaneously, and I think that's a really important nuance that we might want to carry forward. And I mean, especially in the context of the world right now, extreme conflicts are causing tragedy, as Ray mentioned. I think also Pai has kind of pointed towards some trajectories, mainly with reference to Thailand, about new environment or strengthening environmental laws that relate to the disclosure of information, and also about hard-won established transboundary governance mechanisms that are not really the MRC ones, but rather using the courts and the law. So in other words, what's shaping the future is also the hard work of those in the present in creating the institutions for accountability and decision making. I think maybe the last thing I'd say is that there's been comments on whose voice is heard. Ming Li talked about public participation, for example. Pai has pointed towards that there's a wider public awareness of issues, including amongst the youth, and new arenas of discussion, including online spaces. And maybe the last thing that I also think is quite significant about the futures, Raymond mentioned about that there are different ontologies. And I mean, if I translate that to what I understand it to be, there's different realities or different experiences of the relationship between people and the rivers. And I think actually Tarek made that really clear in the sense of describing the perspective of an ecologist and the perspective of an engineer in the way that rivers are looked at. And to me, that also seemed a really fundamental aspect of thinking about futures, like which ways of relating and which knowledges count in thinking about futures. So to me, that's what I got from this first round of discussion. I hope that was a fair enough synthesis of the discussion so far, just to try and pull a little bit together some of the things that were in my mind. So now we will go to the second round of interventions. So we have two kind of forward-looking questions for the panelists. The first question is, which futures are desirable? And the second is, how could those desirable futures be attained? So we'll go through the panel in the same order as the first time. So let me first turn over to Ajahn Chon.
Yes, thank you, Ajahn Khao. I would say the desirable future for the river for me would be the inclusive and sustainable future. Well, I base this future on like sustainable development goals because it's the work that I've been doing. But I think to achieve the inclusive and sustainable future of the river, I think the first thing to do is that we should not consider water just water. We have to consider them in relations to like livelihood, other natural resources, energy, and some other economic and social sectors. The second thing to achieve this future is that I think the water policies should emphasize the inclusive development objective and environmental sustainability objectives more. Well, make them as important as the economic development objectives, or even more important than that objectives. And the third one would be the policy must leave no one behind. It sounds cliche, I know, but what I'm trying to say is that if someone has to lose from the policies, they must be compensated to maintain their level of social welfare prior the policies. We are not talking about trying to help the vulnerables, but how to maintain or even improve their livelihood or social welfare. The fourth one is that we need a platform in which every stakeholder can negotiate and participate. Just like what you synthesized, how can we make sure that all voices are heard? Before the last one, we need open data system and platform for deliberation, so that everyone see the whole picture from every angle, from every ontologies, from every meaning that people give to the water. But all of that would not happen without trust. And I think trust is the most important issue everywhere. I think also in Thailand, trust is one of the key issues where, I mean, that makes people unable to talk to each other. So without trust, people don't trust each other information. They cannot negotiate, and they don't trust the other's commitment. And again, trust cannot happen without empathy. If each of the party do not understand other parties, if they cannot wear others' shoes, trust cannot happen. So I think so we need empathy to create trust. We need facts and data so people can see the same view together, and we need a platform where they can deliberate, negotiate, and all the voices are heard. So then we can have the inclusive and sustainable future for the river. Yeah, that's all I have to say, Captain Khao. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That probably opens up some interesting questions about to what extent do those arrangements exist at present. We'll maybe save that for the Q&A if there are not other questions. Let's turn to Pai now. Pai, I will share the screen.
Thank you, Ajahn Khao. For me, as an activist working to campaign for affected communities in the different basins, the most desirable future of the region's river, in my view, would be the participatory management in decision making for the management of the rivers in our region, particularly with consideration of rights of nature. Not only human can exploit all these resources, but also nature has its own rights. And I think given the stage of the environmental awareness of the world at this moment, I think it's time already to think about the rights of nature to incorporate in the development, decision making and planning, and how to attain this desirable future. I think the only way, there will be multiple ways, but I'm thinking that the most important thing to have is to have the functioning laws, and have the functioning laws that go beyond the national border in order to sustain the richness of the rivers in the region, and how to have the law to cover cross-border investment, how to have the law to cover cross-border population that also use this same basin. And yeah, I believe a lot in better laws and better functioning. And then the one last thing I'd like to highlight is that the stronger public awareness and environmental literacy of the younger generation should shed the brighter light to the future of the region's river, I think. But the problem now is that the power is in the hands of older people, while the younger people have so much hope to the future for the rivers and environment. But I really hope that in the future, these people will be the one who make decision, will be the one who can meaningfully participate in the decision making of the future of the rivers. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pai. I mean, it's an absolute truism that the young are the future, and it's reassuring that you see that their voice is becoming more significant in these discussions. So some really interesting points there that we'll, I think, be coming back to in the Q&A. Can I now turn to Sojon Bright? I'll share the screen again.
Thank you, Dr. Khao. So for me, which one are the most desirable? For me, the free-flowing Salween River is most desirable. The values of the river for its importance to nature, culture, and future. And instead of purely economic, materialist, short-term value of the river, it is important to look into the culture and spiritual aspect. And there are other ways of generating electricity, for example, solar, geothermal, wind, small hydro, etc. But there is no other way to replace a free-flowing river with dignity, culture, identity, and also look into the ontologies, as Raymond also mentioned. And how do we achieve this outcome of the free-flowing river? Well, listening and respecting, recognizing indigenous and local people, and working with academics, anthropologists, development, conservation, NGO, etc. So that more people and governments recognize indigenous relationship with the river, and the river has a culture and spiritual meaning first and foremost. And people are talking about nature-based solution, but it should also cover social, cultural, and political. Free-flowing river means energy democracy, water justice, and peace. In Burma, for example, there is no policy platform within the country right now. Conservation projects cannot be done meaningfully without having legal mechanisms and a government that recognizes democracy and human rights. We need to bring local community voices more into international policy platforms and mechanisms in this case. And we also need meaningful engagement and address real issues on the ground. Like now we have conflict, displacement, and refugees along the river. There is a need for humanitarian assistance. It's urgent. And then we need to work more on empowering civil society organizations and strengthen their role in the context of conflict and displacement, as they are in the center of this situation. And we should also work, I would say, with legal experts to get the river recognized as a legal person who in the form of legal mechanism, so we can take legal actions against threats, like Pai mentioned, the rights of nature. And we should also think about development model as locally owned pathways chosen by local community themselves based on local knowledge and practices, instead of like cookie cut help from development institutions and financial institutions that focus purely on economy and only scientific solution, if you like. Dignity should be the primary starting point for development in this case. And the concept of decolonizing the river is also important here. In the Salon Peace part, decolonization is more than an act of removing external influence. It is an opportunity to learn from other ways of thinking. Karen community have practiced conservation in our own ways, for generations, through waves of colonizations and wars. Now, through the Salon Peace Park, we once again offering our experience to the world, and we hope that everyone can join us in this opportunity and see that decolonization is not just freedom from imposed influence, but also a freedom to learn. So with this model of grassroots governance initiatives, such as the Salon Peace Park, we already have started to realize this better future of the free-flowing Salon River. So I will stop here and would like to discuss more later. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, John. You covered so many really important points there, including the importance of learning for the future and the roles of different types of knowledge. I kind of won't even try and summarize anything from your comments. Let's now turn to Ray. I can see there's one or two questions coming into the chat box. Please add other questions. We'd be really keen to have the panel respond to your thoughts. This is a great opportunity. This group of people don't come together often. This is a good chance to have a chance to ask questions of them. Let's turn now to Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I think the desirable future would be we are living in a scenario where the vulnerable groups are not exploited for being vulnerable. Even we are living in an unequal world, we are still managed to reduce the inequality, and even people have different pursuits of interests, different ideologies, they still manage to achieve coordination, cooperation, and trust in managing our waters. I guess that would be a desirable future. How to achieve that? to me, I think we need to take a critical perspective on knowledge, especially previously Western-centric knowledge. I'm seeing this because the existing water governance knowledge has been established based on a objective that we are going to achieve good governance. Here is the best practice that we can learn. I do not think this is necessarily accurate. To me, I think based on my research, I see a lot of empirical findings which do not, which contradict these previously established knowledge. For instance, the state and the civil society are not necessarily against each other. They can work together. Centralization and decentralizations are not necessarily contradict with each other. Okay, you can achieve both. Development and conservation are not necessarily contradict. So I guess we need to move beyond these good and bad, successful and unsuccessful paradigm. You know, we need to look into the practice, what's really happening, the rules in use on the ground, and not only just look at the label of the governance approach, such as participatory approach or decentralization, polycentric governance, but what they really means in practice. Okay, we've seen so many American-aided program in Africa, you know, under the name of participatory approach, where most of the groups are still marginalized. You know, so I think we need to reshape the knowledge in water governance, and especially develop what we call subaltern geopolitics or subaltern knowledge. You know, that those are underrepresented. You know, those were not being able to contribute to the knowledge that are being used and infused in everywhere globally. You know, especially the indigenous groups and developing countries. I guess, you know, there are so much unknown that we need to focus on that by being critical and also based on ground facts. I think we might be achieve that desirable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. So you've essentially laid out a future academic agenda that really connects with the realities of the region around both values and resource governance. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure that might raise some questions as well as to how that happens, or what does it really mean? Where do we go next? Let's turn to Ming Li. Over to you, Ming Li.
Thanks, Carol. So a desirable future for the river would be one that has inclusive water governance and also acknowledges the ecological connectivity of rivers. So I think what to do here is first, with the 1995 Mekong agreement that the MRC is based on, we need to question the assumptions tied to the agreement that mostly focuses on the Mekong River as just a water course. Okay, so we do have to acknowledge that the river is not artificially segmented by national boundaries, that tributaries are no less important than the mainstream of the river, and that water cannot be divorced from ecosystems and biophysical processes. So I think we should also push for independent, robust, and basin-wide cumulative impact assessments to be conducted as opposed to standalone EIA processes for projects. As to how to make it more decision-making more participatory, we do need to, I guess, incorporate a more bottom-up approach to decision-making. So maybe reconsidering the role for non-state avenues for participation. So beyond track 1 or track 2 avenues, we can pay more attention to supporting civil society who are very experienced in providing alternative spaces for community voices to be heard, where local communities across the Mekong River basin can collectively learn about basin-wide developments that will affect them. and where they can also share their experiences and perspectives with one another. In this case, we could identify case studies in which communities have meaningfully and successfully engaged in environmental stewardship and community-based natural resource management across the basin to highlight the value of engaging these communities in decision-making. I think it's also important to incorporate an intersectional lens that recognizes social differences. So one area I would just like to highlight is gender. So I think both research and policy making on transboundary water governance risk marginalizing the experiences of women who are already disproportionately impacted by these large-scale water infrastructure projects and who are also underrepresented in decision-making. So we need to be really careful about one-size-fits-all type of solutions to achieving these sort of futures. So we could pay more attention to the enabling conditions and barriers to women's participation and pay attention to the pathways through which women have successfully played quite a meaningful role in water governance, but at the same time without increasing a burden of responsibility on them to do so. The last thing I would just like to say is that public participation can also extend to the planning of energy futures, which is really important to tackle the drivers of hydropower development. So even within national governments, there's really a lack of cross-sectoral coordination between government agencies, and more can be done, I think, to holistically incorporate the concerns of government agencies that deal with environment, water resources, and fisheries, for example, into these energy planning processes. So that's all I got to say for now. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ming Lee. I mean, you started with just the very key starting point of the need to re-examine the fundamental tenets of transboundary water governance under the Mekong River Commission with the conceptualization of the river itself. And I think this is, you know, where thinking about the future has to start. Like, what are the assumptions of the present and what needs to be rethought? Let's now go to Tarek for the final intervention for this round. And then I can see questions coming in the chat box. Maybe all the panelists can have a look and see if there are questions that you want to address. I'll also read some of them out as well. And any participants, if you'd like to put in a question, please don't hesitate to put it into the chat box. So Tarek, I'll share the screen with your slides.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. If we could go maybe to the second slide then. So which future is most desirable? Well, the problem is what happens if it feels like, or if it looks like only one future is possible, then not all futures are actually possible. I've got here a quote that came from the recent basin development strategy that the Mekong River Commission has prepared. You can have a read of that, but basically the quote is saying that it sort of documents the collapse in the sediment transport of the Mekong River, you know, from once you know, coming from China into the lower Mekong was 85 and dropped down to 11 million tons per year. And it documents quite well in the document, you know, what happens in the lower Mekong as well, what that means in terms of a wide range of knock-on processes, ecological and social and so on. And then it's the conclusion that it sort of draws is that actually, well, this was it's regrettable. It's something that, you know, we have to try to mitigate or manage as best we can, but it's something that was necessary for the trade-off that is the economic growth that the region has experienced. This idea that it was a sort of a necessary thing, and now that we have the projects there, what can we do about it but mitigate as best we can, is I think the central question that we have to answer if we want to see a different future for the Mekong region. And there's certainly other factors that have enabled us to take this question much more seriously in recent years. For example, there are cheaper, more sustainable alternatives to energy that have emerged in recent years. I'm talking of solar and wind. And they provide options to the energy sector that perhaps weren't there previously. But then the question is of what to do with the degradation, the damage that has occurred already. And maybe, Carl, if we can go to the next slide, the last slide for this. Yeah, that one, perfect. So we've just started done a little bit of analysis with some colleagues. So we had Ajahn Apison, who I think you might be in the room today. I think I saw your name, from Mayfar University is here, and also with the University of Berkeley and Stanford, to look at the possibility of rewilding the Mekong. And we're encouraged by the prospect for this for the Mekong, because there's experiences in North America where long-standing reservoirs have been removed, and actually the system has restored itself, and sediment processes have been, sediment's been remobilized, deltas have been rebuilt, and a lot of the degradation that occurred through the break in connectivity can actually be restored. And so if we look at if we think this is now possible, then we have here the two futures, and you can see similar to what Ming Li was saying about a business as usual future. We have a fragmented and degraded Mekong, or we can have a restored Mekong. And I think personally, the measures that we take in terms of our infrastructure, how we manage our infrastructure, and where we place our infrastructure is going to be central to the which of these futures we end up taking. And I'm really encouraged that we have actually a realistic pathway to explore a restored Mekong. Thanks, Carl.
Great, thank you very much, Tarek. So I think the first point that you made is a really important insight in itself. What happens if only one future seems possible? And I think this is really why we wanted to bring this panel together, to kind of break apart, emphasize the importance of thinking about futures and try and really give time to thinking about this. Like, how could we get to more desirable futures? And then what you've laid out is essentially an agenda that looks at maybe recovering rivers and rethinking past decisions as a consequence for what future ones could be. So we've heard from the panelists some really rich insights, both around the possible futures and the possibilities for desirable futures. I can see that there are questions in the chat box. If others would like to add more in, please do so. Let's go through them, and just if any of the panelists would like to pick up on these questions, then please go ahead. So there's a question on the role of the Mekong River Commission and its recent increasing collaboration with the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation Framework that's connected to China. And so there's a question for the panel about whether this bridging effort deserves to be supported and further enhanced to promote more sustainable, inclusive, and peaceful future for riparian countries of the river system. I'll go through the questions, and then the panelists can pick up any question that they'd like to. A second question is asking about the importance of seriously facilitating local participation, especially those of indigenous communities. And it asks whether it's necessary to have consciously designed advocacy programs to empower decision makers to appreciate the value of local communities' voices and engagement. So it's kind of a two-sided question, like how can maybe the decision makers that are closer to governments, how can they better understand what's being communicated from indigenous movements and other civil society groups? I think the next one is a comment. Then there's another question from Andrea. Based on the discussion, how could things be done differently? Could dams be done differently? Water and rivers are public properties. And he mentions he has a naive idea about exploitation and destruction seems to be done for the sake of people's livelihoods. Why does it not benefit anyone? How can indigenous people have their own way whilst conserving the quality and flow of the rivers? And then a final comment that is an agreement with Ajahn Chon on the importance of trust and hope to create positive feedbacks between people to create some virtuous circle. I hope that I've summarized those clearly. If there's no others, I'll just throw in a couple of other questions if anybody would like to pick them up. Ajahn Chon pointed towards the importance of data and platforms for discussion, but this is a question for the wider group because recently there's been big discussions about water data and water data politics. So, I mean, do these platforms not yet exist, or in a future of water data cooperation, like what would be different to what it is now? Both Pai and Sojong Bright brought up different ways of thinking about the rights of nature or the legal personhood of rivers. And I was wondering if anybody, and I think this also connects actually to Raymond's raised point on multiple ontologies and really widening the scope of what counts, what's valued. So a question around that perhaps would be, I mean, how can that gain traction in this region? I know that it's the legal personhood of rivers has happened in countries like New Zealand. Do you see that this could be a future? How do we get to that type of future? And I think this also connects to Ajahn Chon's comment on climate change, for example. It's not just around infrastructure, but rivers having some form of standing in climate change discussions. For those that are interested in this, you might want to join the panel on the Futures Literacy Lab that will take place at 1 o'clock, because that was a theme that was discussed. I think those would be enough questions for the panel. Would any of the panelists like to respond? We have about 15 minutes for discussion, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. Please go ahead. The floor is open, or the panel is open for anybody that would like to respond to the questions. Tarek?
Yeah, I might, maybe I'll respond to one, Carl, and then pass it on to others to respond as well. But there was one question there about what could be done differently, like this, relating to kind of the, with hydropower, how could we have done things differently? There was a study that was done a couple of years ago by some colleagues at Stanford, and they showed that if you looked at the Mekong Basin and the portfolio of projects that have been developed, and I'm speaking from a sediments perspective particularly, the same quantum of electricity could have been generated with a more sustainable portfolio that had half as much impact on the sediment load. So really the question is, the issue is that the decisions on how we are using, managing and controlling the river is being made from a very narrow set of perspectives, on a very narrow set of values that we're optimizing against. And I think that's in part the big problem. So how do we then extend that kind of, that optimization problem to consider all these other values, these cultural values and social values and environmental values, as well as, say, purely energy generation values. And I think that's where some of the other speakers, where they've talked about the governance models and the types of ways of making things more inclusive is important, and also the idea of personhood and the rights of rivers. So that movement has taken off in some countries, because it actually gives a legitimate place at the table for discussion and decisions about the river to the river itself. So it's sort of it's inclusive governance with the ecological systems as well. That's what that's sort of aiming at, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in our region.
Thanks very much. I think Sojong Bright's hand was up by a margin of a second faster. So let's go to Sojong Bright first, and then we'll go to Ajahn Chon.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Thank you. I'd like to touch on the role of indigenous in conservation. So in the Salween Peace Park, indigenous community understand conservation in a holistic sense. According to our indigenous tradition, human, nature, and the spirit living within us are deeply connected. Forests, land, rivers, they are all connected. The status of one direct correspondence that of the other. So for indigenous Karen, in the Salween Peace Park, a healthy forest means a prosperous and happy life, and also a free-flowing river, a clean river. this worldview came from our indigenous knowledge, shared from generations to generations through traditional poetry. We call it tar in Karen. So Karen indigenous knowledge underpins this our whole society, informing and the shape of our livelihood, institution, and social taboos. So due to this, indigenous Karen community understand conservation as an aspect of daily life. I mean, we call it conservation, but for us, the Karen people, it's our daily life. It is part of our life. So in the Southern Peace Park, we work on this toward the three core views, core goals. One is self-determination and peace, because we need to have peace. Otherwise, we won't be able to have all these conservation and culture practices. And because it is also important for us to work on governance mechanism that makes our local institutions stronger, and also have voices in decision making, as I think in the question also asking about how do we make our voices heard in the policy level. So, and the second one is environmental integrity. Our indigenous territory contribute to protect one of the largest contagious tropical forests in the world, and contribute also combating climate change. So this is very important that we need to look at in this environmental integrity aspect, as it is connected, with the rivers, forests, and land. And the third part is culture survival. And as I just mentioned, our way of life, belief system, and our identity are all deeply connected to the nature. In conserving nature, we support to support the prosperity of ourselves and also future generation. So I would say this is our conservation is part of current indigenous daily life. It is part of our culture. It doesn't have to be somewhere else. I mean, something coming from outside or somewhere else. It doesn't have to be embedded. It is already in our daily life, and it can be sustained. And then government and other stakeholders need to respect and need to recognize this this reality, so that we will be able to have a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So you talked about visions of the future and also the governance of how to get there. Ajahn Chon.
Yes, I'd like to respond to 2 points. The first one is Ajahn Apichai in the comment. I totally agree with Ajahn Apichai that trust and hope are equally critical to the process. And I think the knowledge about the future and the tools related to it, like foresight, processes, those kind of things are very important, because I think when we are in the situation of problems, we tend to look at the past and how to solve the past, but try to see the future can give us hope as well. And the second point is about the data and politics of data. I think it's I mean, right now the languages for water management is based on the engineering and economic languages. So I think to make the data politics become a little bit equal, we need to also try to change how we speak the water languages. I mean, and that involves how we actually see the problem related to water. I think the policymakers see the water question is like economic question, resource allocation, and how can we solve that? We need infrastructure, so that is like engineering question. But I would like to link this to what Ajahn Ray mentioned, that I think essentially he was saying that there's no panacea, right? There's no like medicine that solve every problem. So if everyone recognize that, then we need to find a new view, listen to everyone's voices, recognize all types of research of knowledge, raise new questions, and then perhaps that can lead to a new type of data that we need to gather. So we cannot look at the data separately from something beneath it, the way we view this issue, the question we raise, the solution we're trying to solve. So yeah, I would like to add these points to the issue of the politics of.
Thanks very much, Ajahn Chon. Really important point. So I looked down at my keyboard for 2 seconds and both Ming Li and Pai's hand went up. I didn't see whose hand went up first. Was it Pai? Okay, Pai, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll quickly mention about the foreseeing of the future of our rivers and natural resource management. I think one of the thing that important the most in my view and my experience working to protect all this river is the power. You have power in your hand. You can have very good dialogue. You can have very good stakeholder discussion. But when the power is not there in your hands, you are just small scale fishers. You just gardener. You just indigenous people living in remote forest that would be affected by a large hydropower or water diversion project. So you mean nothing. Like your voice might be heard, but without power, that's something totally different. So how to ensure that the voice of the voiceless and everybody can meaningfully participate in decision making and planning of the natural resource management is a mechanism. We need law, we need better law, we need Parliament Committee on Public Participation, we need National Human Rights Commissions, we need media coverage, and all this can be the mechanism to ensure that everybody is on the same table and have at least maybe not equal power, but empower the marginalized to have better, like larger or stronger voice, so that decision making and planning of the rivers can include their voice.
Thanks, Pai. Some really important strategies on how to rebalance the power inequalities. Ming Li.
Yeah, I agree with Pai. I think what she said is really important, especially if we're talking about recognizing the rights of the river. I think fundamentally, the step before recognizing the rights of the river is to respect and recognize the people who live along the river, like the indigenous people. So if you look at the example of New Zealand, for example, this the rights of the river is really closely tied to the rights of the indigenous people who value the river and who have traditionally lived by the river. I think in Colombia, there's also a recognition that the ordinary person can raise any objections on behalf of the river. So it really comes down to will the Southeast Asian governments ever have that trust and respect for ordinary people to make decisions on behalf of ecological entities. So in terms of what the MRC is doing, I think in terms of having joint studies with the Chinese side, with reaching out to civil society, of course, it's a good start. But again, this is fundamentally alter the power dynamics in the region. I think that's something we need to think about. And I saw a question about the ways that stakeholder dialogues take place according to the rules and platforms that do not respect indigenous communities. So I've attended some of these consultation meetings for the Park Bang Dam, and they're extremely formal. They are in hotel rooms, they are in government offices. You have a panel of government officers sitting there talking in technical terms, and it's very intimidating to step up to the microphone in front of the room and speak directly to them to raise their concerns. So things like this really make a difference. And I think environmental activists have pointed out that what they really need is to look at these principles of free, prior, and informed consent, which take into account what are the setting, languages, and conditions needed for people to be able to process this information about projects and to make decisions about these projects and to have their consent meaningfully recorded in these cases. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ming Li. I think that raised just a somewhat even wider question of where should discussions about the future take place. You talk about project-related decisions in government offices and hotel rooms, but this type of discussion, where should this be taking place beyond this one? To me, place seems really important as well. Let's go to Ray, please.
Yeah, I like our discussion very much. I think the reason that we should look at something bigger, a broader picture, is that there are something invisible playing a very, very important role in the development of the region. For instance, when we talk hydropower is highly controversial, and obviously hydropower is not the ideal way of developing Southeast Asia. But think about it, what other options do Southeast Asians have? You know, being situated in the existing global capitalistic economic system. Okay, this is the invisible power I'm mentioning. I think the American sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein has a very famous theory on a world system. You know, he's basically arguing the entire world system has not changed since the Second World War. Okay, basically he divides the global system as the core countries, semi-peripheral countries, and semi-peripheral countries. The neoliberal economic system and the globalization process have allowed the core countries to exploit resources, labor, you know, everything from peripheral countries. And all the peripheral countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America have tried so hard to move up in the economic system and yet not succeeded. Okay, this is the reality that most of the developing countries are encountering. And I guess hydropower is something that's Southeast Asian countries can control, you know, outside the world economic system. So my point being is, so maybe when we look at the debate on hydropower development, we also need to think about a bigger power system, which is the global economic system. Okay, obviously the indigenous people are also expecting better living conditions, better educations, right? So development is the need for most of the population in Southeastern countries. The question is, what other options are there? Or if we follow the option of building more hydropower plants, how can we improve it, make it more equitable, efficient? I guess this is something that we need to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. I mean, I think that also really connects to Pai's point on recognizing the power relations that are in play and really widens our scope. I mean, the discussion we've had has focused onto rivers and water governance, but as you rightly say, I mean, many of the projects that are being built directly connect into economic systems that are producing things within a global context. We only have a couple of minutes left. I'm not sure if any of the panelists have a final comment that you would like to share. There's also a couple of points that we've kind of only partially covered in the chat box. I think Ming commented a little bit already on the relationship between LMC and MRC and whether the bridging effort is commendable. If anybody has any final comment on that, you might want to add on that. There's also a second comment that was just added in about whether there needs to be more social sciences rather than water management approaches in thinking about water. Maybe this is talking very much to the social scientists that are mainly on the panel, although we have the engineer as well, of course. And I had one other final thought, maybe for Tarek. What would it take to remove dams for rewilding? And if anybody would like to briefly comment on that, we have 1 minute maybe for each of you, if you'd like to comment, add a final thought. I know that we have to finish very soon. Okay, Ajahn Chol, thank you.
Okay, let me give my final thoughts in relation to Ajahn Apichai comments in the chat. I actually agree that we should expand the disciplines involved in water management to like social sciences, but actually to even broader types of knowledge. So I think the concept of transdisciplinary approach is very needed for this kind of complex problems, the transboundary and like the problems that links economic, ecological, and social problems together. We need broader knowledge. We need new questions, and we need a platform to help discuss and find a solution for that wicked problems. So yeah, so I totally agree with Ajahn Apichai, but we need to expand even broader than that. Yes, that will be my concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Ajahn Chol. I think we'll go around the panel, and if you'd like to say a final thought, please do. Pai.
What I'm seeing to the river in the region, particularly the Mekong right now, or the Salawin, is that it's been under construction, industry-driven kind of development. Hydropower here, water diversion over there, or embankment along the border. So it's ignoring the real value of the river and ignoring other stakeholders that utilize the ecosystem services of the river, while making profit for private companies, for the banks, and for construction companies. So I think, yeah, thank you very much for Jula and Ajahn Karl inviting me to this panel. I think it's very good to like forward thinking and thinking about the future. What do we prefer? And this can be the step one for the conversation that to have in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pai. I can see that there are some links being provided in the chat box. Please check those out, those that are interested. And if you have any other that you'd like to add, please go ahead before we close the panel. John Bright.
Thank you, Dr. Karl. I think we discussed a lot already. And yeah, there are a lot of keywords that when keywords that I catch up in the discussion is bottom-up approach. No? So in this future of the river, when we think about how to develop the future of our river, I think bottom-up approach is very important in this kind of future thinking. No? And more practically, you know, there are other ways of like generating electricity, solar, geothermal, you know, wind, small hydro, etc. But there is no other way to replace a free-flowing river with the dignity and cultural identity, and also different ontologies. There is also nothing that can replace the importance of a clean, free-flowing river for biodiversity. The Salawin, for example, supports some of the most biodiverse forests, wetlands, and waterscapes in Asia now, which is also very important in combating climate change and conserving biodiversity globally. And also, you know, a free-flowing river also still supports micro hydroelectric generation for local community. So when we look at all these practicality, yeah, we can come out like a bottom-up approach in thinking about this future of the river, thinking about indigenous community, and also thinking about, you know, power relations and grassroots governance institution initiative. All these are very important to consider in thinking about the future of the rivers. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. Ming Lee, just a 1 minute summary we're almost at the end of the time.
Okay, so yeah, just picking up on the idea of bottom-up approaches and grassroots approaches, I think, you know, it's really important to support community-based natural resource management initiatives. I know it may not sound as sexy as like saying a dam or a huge campaign, but it's really important to support these sort of grassroots initiatives and conservation initiatives on the ground, because ultimately, you know, it's all these local commons that are protected by and used by local people that make up the larger river commons that we are looking at the transboundary level as well. So how do we you know, support that, and how do we also establish connections between these sort of local efforts to protect the environment at you know, a higher regional level?
You're on mute, Carl.
Sorry, thank you very much, Ming Lee. Ray, any final concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think we had a great discussion, and we all agree perhaps, you know, business as usual is not likely to bring us a desirable future. So I guess we just need to reshape the political system, empower the weak, reshape the economic system, allow more equal opportunities for the less developed countries, and also maybe reshape the academia. We obviously need some more diversity in the knowledge on water governance. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ray. That's a really clear agenda. And finally to Tarek.
I might just answer your question, Carl, as my concluding comments. I think what's needed would be a couple of things. First is, well, we have the technology already with solar and wind to replace the hydropower that the countries have relied on. And so now there are alternatives, as Raymond mentioned, that the alternatives are important. I think we have alternatives, both from a technology point of view, but also from a point of view of the type of generation. So solar and wind are more amenable to distributed systems, and they will also offer or open up opportunities for a more equal, inclusive approach to power generation. And then the other thing that we need is to think about the reality of removing these dams. They're big investments. There's a lot of investment that's gone into these projects, but I think also in that space, there's now efforts on a climate change perspective to kind of to buy coal power stations and close them early. And I think that kind of thing could apply to large hydro as well. So we just need, I think, a little bit of imagination and a chance to think creatively about what the future might be.
Thanks very much, Tarek. So you leave pathways forward and creative thinking to get to those futures. I'm afraid I feel very sad we've come to the end of the time already for this panel. This has been a really inspiring panel for me. I'm glad that all the panelists agreed to join. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts and to answering the questions that were set. Thank you also very much to the participants, both those that have shared your questions and then also the others that have joined to listen to this discussion. I think it's been really enriching. And from my perspective, I'm not even going to attempt a summary, but rather just to echo Pai's thought that I would like to see more discussions like this moving forward. I think this type of discussion is really important in rethinking a future of the region and the role of rivers and people within it. So with that, we will close this panel. Thank you again, panelists and participants, for joining, and hopefully see you in similar discussions in the future.